The trees end, and like a cat out of water, Jacob pounces out of the woods and onto the dry grass. The sun set just above the horizon, casting shadows from the dancing branches as the wind rustled through the haunted grounds. Jacob turns around and looks at the thick brush. He wonders how he managed to even get through it before pausing and looking around. "Thomas?" It was starting to become routine. "Thomas!" He screams, this time his heart pounding against his ribcage like a 3-year-old playing a xylophone, off rhythm and destructive. He runs down the grassy knoll in a hopeful yet frantic attempt. This causes him to trip over his shoes, and he begins to roll faster and faster down the hill. The smell of hay and manure fills his nostrils as the pinching bite of his allergies kick in. Each roll spits dust right back up into his nose. This experience is uncomfortable, to say the least. The hill flattens out, and Jacob flings into a pile of fresh, very fresh, manure. He shoots himself up and begins to gag as the smell of fecal matter settles in his nasal cavity. He cries out. As his, rightfully so, short burst of rage subsides, Jacob begins to explore. Below the hill, he sees a field filled with corn, almost ready for harvest. Not too far from the field was a farmhouse. Civilization. Maybe they can help me look for Thomas. He begins to walk towards the farmhouse, but is interrupted when his stomach erupts in demand for sustenance. Oh boy, I'm getting hungry. He looks toward the field of produce and begins to walk toward them. I'll just grab a little bite first. He shifts his focus to the wooden fence surrounding the large field, and then towards the closed gate up front. Across it, the words written out said, "Farmer Cobbard's Farm. Fleshies, keep out." He steps into the cornfield and focuses his eyes on the scarecrows strategically placed upon it. Upon further inspection, he saw that the scarecrows were exactly that. What he sees is not your typical Farmer Brown in overalls made of hay. Instead, it is a 6-foot humanoid crow with a farmer's cowboy rancher hat, feather and all. It makes Jacob feel unsapped. The stalks reach tall and left Jacob with a very shallow view line from which to see. The field is a maze. This causes Jacob to constantly remind himself not to wander too far or he will get lost. So instead, he grabs a stalk of corn and begins to shuck it. Despite not being cooked, Jacob's stomach would be fine with just having some sort of sustenance. He bites into the corn and begins to chew. It tastes so fresh and crunchy, it satisfies him beyond belief. He finishes his first cob and throws it aside next to his posted friend. He grabs another and begins to shuck once more. He takes another enormous munch into the corn and becomes addicted to the sweet substance. Cob after cob, the pile begins to build up next to the scarecrow. Jacob's stomach begins to feel full, but his desires were barely met. He kept eating and eating until... Shoo! Huh? Jacob turns around and his eyes widen at the sight which lays before him.
I said shoo, fleshy! Get out my crops!
Standing in front of him is an even more lifelike version of the scarecrow to his right. Jacob begins to scream loudly at the sight of such a beast. The chromanoid begins to chase Jacob off with its wings, commanding him, shouting, "Shoo off, fleshy!" Jacob begins to think, okay, this must be a dream. If I let this bird kill me, maybe I'll wake up. Jacob pauses mid-run, turns around, and faces the beast. With the explosiveness of a track star, he rushes it. What in tarnation? The bird screams as it turns around and begins to run from Jacob. Jacob notices the bird is afraid of him and stops running. "Why are you trying to run me off?" Jacob asks the creature in hopes that it would respond to him. The bird's look of fear fades off his face.
Sorry, I thought you were a normal fleshy. You must be Thomas's brother. Jacob, right?
Jacob's eyes widen in the mere mention of his brother's name. "You have my brother?"
Yeah.
The bird nodded his head and in a thick farmer accent said,
Made his way down the farmhouse.
Jacob, feeling a little more comfortable with the bird, walks closer and says, "Oh, thank you. When was this?" The bird stares at him with a blank expression. Slowly, it blinks. Jacob, feeling slightly uncomfortable, looks around and then repeats his question.
I heard you. I just don't understand the principle of your question. I don't understand the word when.
Jacob, puzzled, looks at the bird and says, "Okay, well, around what time did he make it to your farm?" The bird looked down at Jacob and then up towards the sun.
Dusk, I guess. It's always dusk at my Feeble farmhouse.
Jacob, now in absolute confusion, says, "Never mind. Can you take me to Thomas, Mr.
Cobbard. Brandon Cobbard."
Jacob chuckles a little and says, "You don't look like a Brandon to me." Farmer Cobbard squawks and says,
Well, you ain't exactly Jacob.
Jacob gawks at this appearing insult and didn't know why. What is that supposed to mean? The two of them walk down towards the edge of the cornfield. Along the fence rested presumably Farmer Cobbard's tractor. They both hop on and begin to drive towards the farmhouse.
You're not from around here, are you, boy?
Farmer Cobbard asks him. Jacob shakes his head. "No, sir. One moment, my brother and I are on our way to go camping. The next, we're being chased out of the woods, and now I'm here." Farmer Cobbard nods his head along as he speaks.
I see. Most fleshy around these parts don't talk much.
Jacob found himself caught in a state of astonishment. Most crows don't talk where I'm from either, and they're a lot smaller. Farmer Cobbard reaches his hand over and stops the tractor, turning to face Jacob. He points at him and says,
I ain't no crow, boy.
This was accompanied by a long pause and a very unsettling feeling in Jacob's stomach. The farmer cuts through the tension.
Well, back to the homestead now.
Farmer Cobbard starts the tractor back up, and the two enjoy the ride back to the barn in complete silence. Jacob feels uncomfortable at the actions of the bizarre creature. The two return to find Thomas playing with a beautiful golden retriever. Jacob presumed this was the farmer's dog.
Oh, who's a good doggy, Cujo? I'm back.
Thomas, step back from that dog. Jacob calls to his brother hesitantly.
Relax, she's fine,
the farmer says to Jacob.
Beautiful dog she is.
The farmer then reaches into his pocket and pulls out a single flower petal. It was orange and purple, and to what Jacob thinks, very medicinal. Cujo sat in front of Farmer Cobbard as he fed her the petal. She then walked over to her bed and fell asleep. The crow lifts its heavy wings as if to block Cujo from hearing him.
They ain't daisies, but enough of these and you sure will see 'em.
He begins to squawk and chuckle, as much as any crow can, and then winks at the boys. Jacob turns his head to face his brother. At that moment, their eyes make contact, glee striking their faces, electrocuting their bodies into action. Jacob! I couldn't find you. I'm glad you're safe. I missed you so much. Thomas sprints to his brother and fully embraces him in a hug, squeezing with all his might. I missed you too, buddy. I was also worried. As they talked, Farmer Cobbard walked over to Cujo's bed, stroking her fur. He holds out some meat for her to chow down on. She begs like a normal dog, Jacob thinks, and she looks well trained. I do have to say, Farmer Cobbard, she does look like a good dog. Jacob looks over to her bowl and notices a spoilage of meat. What is that you're feeding her? The farmer lifts one wing to the back of his neck, rubbing it hesitantly.
Oh, just some of the livestock, I suppose. I give her the ones that don't sell in the city.
Jacob thinks that his response seemed lacking. However, Thomas's eyes brightened at the mere mention of livestock. What animals do you raise? Are they cows? He screams in excitement. Farmer Cobard shifts his eyes back and forth between the two brothers.
Oh, some of the fleshies.
As Jacob's face grew in concern, Thomas's face equally grew in curiosity. Fleshies? Can I see them? He begs. Jacob walks past his brother, grabbing him by the wrist.
Not now.
He then turns back to Cobard. We need to figure out what's going on first before we start playing with the, livestock. Now, come on, Thomas. I think it's time to go. Cobard opens his beak in protest.
Now, ain't you two gonna stay for dinner?
Jacob turns back to Cujo, who is finishing up her dinner. She looks over at him, sticks her tongue out, and smiles. Oh yes, of course, Jacob says. But what other livestock do you have around here? He asks, afraid of the answer.
Oh, you know, just the fleshies, Cobard squawks. Everything else I grow, like my corn and such.
Oh, Jacob says with a soft, yet empty laugh. Then the most uncomfortable thought begins to cross his mind. So then, what do you use for fertilizing your crops? The farmer looks at Jacob blankly and says,
Come on, kid. Use your brain. I only got one kind of livestock, so...
Now, Jacob could, but he dare not think about what he fell into. He pushes the thought back before gagging. During these moments, Thomas sat to play with some knickknacks on the floor. Hey, Farmer Cobard, can you help us get home? The farmer had retreated into the kitchen to prepare tonight's dinner.
There is no going home for you two.
Jacob's heart drops as he looks through the kitchen window. He holds out a finger in protest. Yes, excuse me, but we would like to get back to our homes. The farmer was chopping up carrots and other greenery before he slaps his appendages to the counter.
I'm sorry, but you can't go home. Now please, just wait until dinner is ready, and I can tell you what happens next.
Jacob walks away from the window, not wanting to think what will happen next. He sees Thomas playing with the dog. Psst, psst, Jacob whispers to his brother. Thomas looks up from playing with Cujo and smiles. Come here, Thomas, Jacob whispers. Thomas crawls to his older brother and says, What is it? Jacob looks back to the kitchen and says, I don't have a good feeling about this place. Thomas is struck with an expression of shock. What do you mean? Farmer Cobard is really nice, and Cujo is adorable. Jacob grabs at his brother's wrist and says, Thomas, you're just going to have to trust me, okay? The two of them whisper back and forth before compromising on a formidable escape plan. They look out the window and into the forever horizons. Ahead in the east lay fields upon fields of dry grass, and behind towards the west was the freaky forest from however long before. We could run to the fields. We would need food and water, but it's either that or back into the woods, Jacob says to his brother. We could make a mind control helmet and fly Farmer Cobard with us to our home, Thomas shouts while pumping his fist into the air uncontrollably.
Yeah, what was that?
Farmer Cobard sticks his head out through the window. Nothing, nothing, Jacob said as he quickly shoos him out of the conversation. Thomas, you need to take this serious. We could die. Thomas brings his hand to his chin and begins to rub it. I'm thinking, I got it! Jacob sighs at his brother's lack of quietness. What do you have, Thomas? Thomas lifts a finger and closes his eyes, formatting the plan inside of his head. I have a formidable plan for escape. He had pronounced every syllable with deep intent. Yeah, I got that much.
Supper's ready.
Farmer Cobbard calls from the window. Thomas looks up at his older brother in regards of what to do next. Through his teeth,
Well, Thomas, it looks like it's time for us to eat.
yes, Thomas says mischievously. It is time for us to eat. He says this while lifting his hands up in literal air quotes. Farmer Cobbard stares at the two with a quizzical expression.
Yeah. Anyways, I wasn't sure what fleshies like you two eat, so I just made you what I feed the livestock.
Farmer Cobbard sets 2 plates down and pulls back chairs for both Thomas and Jacob.
Go ahead now, don't be shy. Sit down.
He beckons them. The 2 brothers sit down in their respective spots and pull themselves forward. The plates that lay before them are displayed with carrots and lettuce, as well as chunks of a foreign meat. Jacob looks in horror, turns over to Thomas, and notices that he is already chowing down on his plate. He looks at his brother in a concerned manner before yelling out, "Thomas!" Farmer Cobbard looks at Jacob and says,
It's fine. Though your brother is right, Thomas. But I get you two are starving.
He looks directly at Thomas and says,
You can go ahead and eat while your brother and I pray for our meal.
Jacob's jaw drops. Did you say pray for our... Real quick, Farmer Cobbard, I don't mean to be picky, but I do have to know what kind of meat you are feeding us. Farmer Cobbard looks at the boys and then begins to laugh hysterically.
Oh, you thought... Oh, don't worry. It's not pork. It's goat.
Jacob shrugs because anything is better than what he had in mind. The 3 of them bowed their heads and began to pray. As the meal progresses, Jacob's lack of understanding was beginning to overwhelm him. So, where are we, Farmer Cobbard? Jacob asks, giving in to his lust for knowledge. The farmer brings his wing to his temple and rubs against it.
Well, right now we are at the Feeble Farmhouse.
He then turns his body around and points west towards the woods.
Those part round there are known as the Wandering Woods. It's where your brother says y'all were chased. Over yonder are the Forgotten Fields, and beyond that, eventually Atlas, I do believe.
Jacob, now more lost and very frustrated, asks his question in a more direct tone. Yeah? But where are we? One moment we are on a trail, and the next we're lost wandering the woods. And as far as I know, where we come from, birds don't talk. We only walked for less than an hour in those woods. So tell me, Farmer Cobbard, how did my brother and I end up at your farm instead of our home? Cobbard lowers his beak and says,
You don't understand, Jacob. You two are never going back home. You can't.
Jacob looks at Cobbard in disbelief. You're lying. Why can't we go home? Cobbard lifts his beak and says,
It's because you boys are dead. This world isn't one of age, but it's a trail. A trail to either a new life or avoided death. You're in the journey world, the land of the dead, if you presume.
Thomas stops eating, looks over at his brother, and begins to cry. Jacob, I don't want to be dead. Jacob holds out a finger towards his brother, telling him to just wait on one moment. We can't be dead. We are still here. If we were dead, that would just be it. Well, unless there is more. But would we not know we died? The farmer shrugs his shoulders and says,
I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just a harvester.
Jacob begins to feel unsettled. Okay, well, if we are dead, what's next? Is this the afterlife? And if so, who was right? The farmer softens his eyes, ignoring Jacob's questions, and instead asks his own.
do you two have your lanterns?
The brothers look at one another, and without a spoken word passing between them, they asked if the other had their lantern. They nod, and they reach into their bags, pulling them out.
What are they for?
Jacob asks. The farmer's face grew with intense seriousness as he began to pull the right words from his mind to tell a story.
When light from one's life fades out of their eyes as they count their last breaths, the flame of life is transferred from one wick to another. Inside each and every bit of creation is light, and not just any light, but light from Atlas, light from the Creator himself. As time from one existence flows into another, so does that very light, and it fires one soul. Life in itself was a journey through time, and now that life has ended, so has the constriction of time. Where we are, it doesn't exist, because where we are is a trail. From this point on, you will follow the light of your lanterns to Atlas. But do be warned, those who have put their light out are now lost to roam the land of the dead, and others feed off the light of Atlas. The journey is not a long one, but it can be if you listen to the wrong voices.
Jacob pauses as he processes the words he is hearing. Thomas raises a hand in question.
Yes, boy,
the farmer asks. Thomas lowers his hand and says, "What wants our lights, and why?" The farmer frowns as much as any bird with a beak can, and says,
That's an excellent question. We call it Lukazu, or the Light Thief. It is a big, scary-looking creature with leathery wings and tufts of black fur. It wears a cloak of shadows and has the head of a wolf. It doesn't have any legs and glides instead of walks. Its golden eyes are often the last thing people will see before it grabs you with its white tail made of shell. You'll recognize it once you see it.
Jacob laughs nervously. Yeah, sounds like it. The farmer continues.
But it is not the only thing to watch out for in the fields. Others will mislead you. Lukazu is an entity among a certain breed of creature here called the Shufum, or guides to the darkness. Demons, if you will.
Jacob, now even more uncertain of the reality he found himself in, asks with a pure curiosity, "And what do they look like?" The farmer lifts a single claw and says,
"They..."
Smack! The farmer's head falls to the wooden table below. The combination of lack of consciousness and gravity did a good day's work. "What?" Jacob says. He lifts the farmer's wing. It falls limp to the table. "Farmer Cobbard?" The farmer was out cold. Thomas stood up from his chair, smiling ear to ear. "We did it!" he screams. Jacob looks at his brother. "What did you do?" Thomas looks back to his older brother and says, "We gave him some of Cujo's flowers to make him see the daisies. See?" Jacob looks at Cobbard's plate and sees the purple and orange flower petals mixed into the sauce. Thomas, that could have killed him. In fact, Jacob walks over to the unconscious farmer and doesn't feel the rise and fall of his chest. "Yeah, he's dead. You just killed the one guy who seemed to know what was going on," he scolds his brother. "How do you even know he can die? We are in the land of the dead." Thomas mocked his older brother, feeling as if he outsmarted him, and sticks his tongue out. Jacob, however, feels sickened by his brother's lack of empathy in the given situation. "Good point, but still, he was about to tell us how to get to Atlas. Well, let's get some food and measle our way there, I guess." The two of them ransack the farmhouse and bottle up as much water as they can to make for the journey ahead. What do you think Atlas will be like, Jacob? Jacob thought for a moment and says, well, if it's anything like heaven, I think we'll just be fine. Thomas nods his head. Yeah, with lots of candy and girls in pretty clothes. Jacob smiles at the innocence of his brother. Maybe he was thinking of his own mother. Maybe.